This is a topic that is covered in any first-year econ course and is one of the most fundamental principles of economics, but is alarmingly misunderstood. The question is, how do companies choose their prices? This is a very important concept that we'll be coming back to in the future again and again. So I wanted to create this as a reference video. I try to avoid explanations that rely too much on mathematics, since I don't believe that that works for most learning styles. Mathematics is required to understand these concepts at a granular level, but a high-level understanding can be achieved conceptually. I'm sure that most people will see this as review, but it's a good video to share with others since it explains things in a very down-to-earth way. So let's jump right into it. Let's say you want to buy a loaf of bread and you have several options. One seller is selling the bread for $5, one is selling it for $3, and one is selling it for $2. Which one will you buy, assuming that all three bakers sell identical loaves? The answer is pretty obvious. You'll buy the $2 loaf. Why wouldn't you? Well, there are reasons you might actually buy a more expensive loaf, but by and large, the person selling the cheaper loaf will tend to make more sales. Now, let's say that this was the entire market for bread. What would happen over time? Well, the overpriced sellers just wouldn't sell any bread. Their businesses have overhead. They have to pay for utilities, rent, employees, and so on. But they aren't making any money because each individual is making the rational decision to buy the lowest price bread they can find. The options are clear. Either these businesses can lower their prices or they can stop selling bread. This is a mistake that many small businesses make under bad management. When sales are down, the knee-jerk reaction is to raise prices to compensate for the lost profits. However, this backfires since higher prices will result in fewer customers. There was a kitchen supply store in my neighborhood a while back that was always empty. One day I decided to go in and check it out and found that all their prices were inflated. A large kitchen supply chain had a store nearby that was selling similar items at a lower price. Well, there's no question why the smaller store had no customers, and sure enough, they ultimately went out of business. There's another possibility worth examining. What happens if all three bakers form a cartel and decide to price fix at $5 per loaf? That might work for a while, but it gives each baker an incentive to cheat. If anybody was to sell a loaf for $4, they immediately gain a competitive advantage over the other bakers. This can be done in secrecy, where a baker sells a loaf to a third-party vendor or grocer who resells the loaves at a slight markup. In addition to that, anyone can bake a loaf of bread, so the cartel will have to compete with firms from outside the cartel, which defeats the purpose of having a cartel. Ultimately, all confidence-backed cartels of this nature will collapse back down into free market pricing. This, of course, is assuming that the cartel exists in a free market. But what would happen if the government stepped in and protected the bread bakers cartel by imposing licensing and regulation that prevented external firms from competing with the cartel? Suppose that you had to get FDA approval in order to sell a loaf of bread. That could be used as a mechanism to keep out competitors and prop up price fixers. Obviously, price fixing is illegal, however, not all price fixing is overt enough to be detected by regulators. And this is kind of what happens in reality. Of course, the Bakers cartel is greedy, but that cartel never would have existed in the first place without regulators shutting down their competition. I want to clarify that this is only an example for illustrative purposes, and there probably isn't a bread bakers cartel. Organizations like the FDA certainly do cause inflated prices, especially in pharmaceuticals, but in reality, there's sufficient competition in the bread industry that prices are not too out of control. But I'd still argue that the food industry isn't exactly a free market. To make matters worse, regulators are still human at the end of the day, and humans are corruptible. Regrettably, regulators do get bought and sold, and this is one technique that corporations will use to price gouge. But now we're no longer talking about a free market. I mean, I hate to sound like a cynic, but these regulations are ultimately enforced through violence. Sell a loaf of bread without kissing the king's ring, and you'll be shut down by the police, who will issue fines, seize your assets, and even destroy your property. Anyway, I'm going to save monopolistic pricing for another video, but I'll give you a quick spoiler. Even in a monopoly, companies don't necessarily have the ability to price gouge. Prices are just determined by the laws of supply and demand, and are heavily influenced by external factors such as substitutes. But generally speaking, monopolistic prices tend to be significantly higher than free market prices. Companies and individuals will try to corner the market if they can in order to achieve a monopoly. They'll use tricks like predatory pricing or buying out the competition. I might come back to this and do an in-depth video on this topic in the future, but for now, it's suffice to say that these practices are not sustainable in a free market. Companies that engage in this behavior will take massive losses over time and eventually become insolvent. However, these techniques are commonly used and quite effective in highly regulated markets. So to review, prices tend to be pushed down in free markets as lower priced goods and services compete favorably against higher priced goods and services. That being said, when you're buying a good or service, you should never assume that the price is as low as possible. That would be an irrational assumption that can result in you having to pay above market prices. One example where this is extremely common is convenience counters, which take advantage of impulse buying. Always shop around for the lowest price and the highest quality you can get. Ultimately, this behavior is the force that drives down prices. But how low will prices go? Well, they'll go as low as possible, of course. A competitive firm will take nearly no profits. Profits are defined as the extra money made off of a sale after subtracting all expenses. So suppose it costed a firm $2 to make a loaf of bread on average after paying for utilities and rent and labor. If one firm tried to sell a loaf for $2.50, someone might come along and sell the same loaf for $2.40, and so on, all the way down to $2. There are ways for companies to turn a profit in a competitive market, but margins will always be slim. As an example, consider Walmart, probably the largest seller in the world, which only has razor-thin profit margins of about 3%. These profits are typically used to grow the company, but they can also be saved for a rainy day. There's an exception to this rule, and it's when there is a shortage. Imagine if suddenly a lot more people than expected started buying up loaves of bread. You'd run into a situation where you might actually run out of bread. To mitigate this, firms will increase their prices. When prices are high, people tend to buy less of an item. Again, I see a lot of confused people arguing that these firms will deliberately create shortages in order to maximize their prices. But this ignores the fact that if a single company did this, their competitors would step in and fulfill the demand, so that scheme doesn't work. Another scenario is that a company accidentally created too much bread, and if they don't sell it, it'll go bad. That's a waste, so a profit maximizing company might temporarily lower their prices and take a loss in order to sell more bread. That might sound bad, but wasting $1 on a loaf of bread is better than wasting the entire $2 loaf. It's also possible that the raw ingredients to make a loaf of bread are cheap and most of the costs are fixed. In that case, it might actually make more sense to just throw away the loaf than to lower prices. That's getting a bit outside of the scope of this video though. Let's go deeper and break down the anatomy of that $2 loaf. Well, some of that cost is going to be labor. Someone needs to actually bake the loaf. But there's more to it than just that. There's the cost of management, janitors, accountants, support staff, delivery personnel, HR, and so on. All of that needs to be built into the price of a loaf of bread. There's also the price of rent and utilities, and of course ingredients, flour, eggs, yeast, and whatever. But how are those prices determined? Well, the raw ingredients, just like the finished product, are commodities being sold in competitive markets. And for that reason, they are priced as low as possible. A baker might buy his eggs from a grocer. If a grocer is overcharging, the baker will shop elsewhere. Grocers buy their eggs from farmers. Farms that sell their eggs above market price will lose business to farms that sell their eggs at the market price. One of the expenses that both farmers and grocers and bakers have to face is the price of electricity and water. Unfortunately, these markets are typically monopolized in most of the first world. Governments tend to control these markets, and just because it's run by government doesn't mean that they don't exploit the fact that they have a monopoly. In fact, it's the worst type of monopoly because governments have the ability to make competition illegal. That's why your electricity bill is soaring. The cost of land or rent is also built into the price of a good. But there's a big difference in the way that land is priced compared to the way that a good, like a loaf of bread, is priced. If there's a shortage of bread, you can always make more bread. But if there's a shortage of land, you can't just make more land. In most of the world, land is always in short supply. Therefore, the price of land is not determined by the cost of the inputs, but by its scarcity. In fact, in areas where land is not scarce, such as the Canadian territories, land is absolutely free for anyone who wants it. Each seller of land needs to compete with each other seller by selling his land for at least as cheap as the other sellers. Each buyer of land needs to compete with each other buyer by offering to pay as least as much as the other buyers. Finally, let's examine the cost of labor. First, let me clear something up. What is the relationship between employer and employee? In our society, we've constructed a ton of legal definitions for what it means to be employed. But when you get right down to it, the employer is a buyer and the employee is a seller. The commodity being bought and sold is labor. An employer buying wage labor from an employee is really no different from an individual buying time from an accountant or a plumber or a hairdresser. People tend to get this relationship backwards. The general mentality seems to be that the resource being traded is jobs. It's not. Thus, labor is priced the same as land. It is a scarce resource. Each person who is looking for a job needs to compete with each other person by choosing to work harder or for less pay. Each company looking to hire an employee needs to compete with each other company by offering to pay as least as much as the other companies for equal or less work. If a company is paying wages below the market rate, it means that there will always be someone else who is willing to pay more. However, if employees are getting paid above the market rate but not delivering productive work out of that, it means that there will always be someone who is willing to do the same work for less. This is especially unfortunate if that person happens to be unemployed. This scenario also means that inflated prices are passed on to the business's customers, meaning that they'll buy less of a good or service being sold, meaning fewer employees can be hired. That may imply a higher unemployment rate, but not necessarily. Another outcome is that it adds to the pool of people who need to compete with each other on price in order to get a job. So, for every person who is getting paid above the market rate, there is another person who is getting paid below the market rate. The exception is where there is a minimum wage that prevents the latter person from working at all. I would expand on this point by suggesting that virtually all costs are ultimately a result of scarcity, or at least they should be. If we go back to the cost of electricity, the inputs required to generate electricity are the natural resources, which are scarce, the labor, which is scarce, and the land, which is scarce. Anything that is not scarce is basically free. And again, it should be free. Of course, that's not the way that the world works. People have always had a tendency to try to sell non-scarce resources for a profit. This behavior is called rent-seeking and is a contentious subject because it siphons value out of society. A couple notable examples of this are patents and copyrights, but I'll save that debate for another video. Oh, and despite the name, charging rent to tenants is not rent-seeking behavior because land is a scarce resource and using it for housing squanders it away from being used to create value. That lost opportunity cost needs to be paid for somehow. Otherwise, no one will want to build houses or apartment complexes. They'll just build factories, farms, and shops. Alright, well that's all I have to say about this topic. Leave your questions in the comments section. If you disagree with something, I'd love to hear it. Thanks for watching and subscribe for more JS Economics.